All right, hey there, everybody. I've been talking about doing one of the full edits from beginning to end from the senior session. If you saw my video going over the behind the scenes, I talked a little bit about my thought process and lighting and some of the gear going over the shoot. But I'd like to take this photo and we'll kind of run through, hopefully fairly quickly, just beginning to end edit, do, I guess, a little bit of skin retouching, a little bit of object removal, color contrast, nothing too fancy. And let's see if we can push this out to a final product. So let's get started. So initially, right off the bat, a lot of times here in Lightroom, I want to go and enable my profile corrections. You can see how it brightens up the edges a little bit and takes a slight bit of that distortion out of there. And I click on the remove chromatic aberration, which here in this case, there's a little bit around the fingers there. There's nothing jumping out real bad about the chromatic aberration, so this image is totally fine. I shot this I believe at f1.4 1,000th of a second. ISO was 80 and 85mm G Master lens on my Sony A7iii. I used a flash in this particular shot, but I still wanted it to look not overly dramatic, still somewhat close to natural light. So I had the flash camera right. You can tell from where some of the shadows are on her face and neck and where they fall around where the light was placed. So I used flash for this shot, and I wanted to keep it still somewhat close to a natural feel, not overly dramatic. And I had the light camera right of the subject on this one, and I didn't have to shoot at a very high power to get this type of look. So let's try to push as far as we can here in Lightroom before we go to Photoshop for any more details. One thing that jumps right off the bat here is going to be the way the photo looks a little crooked when you're out doing these long sessions and you're carrying around a big battery grip and a few different lenses like I do. They tend to get pretty heavy over time, and you'll notice your frames start to tilt slightly during a session. Now I want to brighten this up a little bit to add a little bit more life to it. If we pump up the shadow some, we're already getting a nice little effect there without going too crazy and making it look like some cheesy fake HDR effect. So we'll turn up the shadows a little bit. I like to add a little bit of contrast. Mainly, I like to do contrast in Photoshop, but you can push it a little bit here in Lightroom without affecting your skin tones or colors. So if we turn it up really high, you see how she starts to get that real orangish glow in her skin. It just doesn't look really good at all. So if I do contrast here, it's just going to be on a slight little edge to make her skin pop a little bit. Now, to make that pop even more, we can either turn up our full exposure, which that looks pretty good. It looks like a nice natural lit shot there, even though we used a flash for the photo, but it's controlling the entire image. I want to go in and try to control her separately from the background. So Lightroom's new feature for select subject is pretty darn amazing. There's very few times where it doesn't work out for me. So we're going to click on that select subject. You can see how it's tracing her out here. It does a very good job. So we can turn up the exposure on her just a hair, and if we turn up the whites a little bit, it'll make just the parts of the skin that I like to pop instead of bringing up the shadows a whole bunch even more after that. So now it looks like she's starting to really separate there from the background. So now what I want to do is create another mask because I want to control the background this time. So I'm going to select the subject as I did before with the new mask. So now that it's got her, what I'm going to do is invert it. So now we're controlling everything behind her. And I'm going to bring that down just a little bit with the exposure. I'm going to add a little bit of clarity to it, a little bit of texture to it. It's starting to look pretty good. So when we get her sitting on the stairs, her dark outfit here helps separate her from the stairs. And with the background here, this foliage and browns and greens being much different than the bright skin tone here really helps make her pop from the photo. So we haven't had to do much to this already, and it's looking pretty darn good. This already could be a deliverable image. But of course, we're going to take it a little bit farther. I want to turn up the vibrance. There we go. Added some more life to it. What I like to do is in my shadows is add a little bit of a color. So usually I'll drag one of these down in my shadows here, get it to about a saturation of 10, and then I can pull this around to see as colors affect my shadows and then decide what I like best. So in a lot of outdoor sessions like this with foliage, I like to add it a little bit more into the warmer side for the shadows, so we can go somewhere around this magenta and reddish feel. But to me, that 10 on the shadows for the saturation is too much. So I'm going to dial this back to a 5. And if we turn this off and on, there's the before and the after. So now we have this warm, just hint of a warm glow in the shadows around the subject. So at this point in time, it's about ready to go in Photoshop. Skin tone looks good. I like the colors. I know a lot of people like to get. It's real common nowadays to see someone turn down the saturation in the greens. So either you can go to your saturation tab here and turn it down like this because that's fairly green in the back, or again you can grab your little tab here next to saturation. This works on hue as well, and you can click and drag on this down here and pull it down. There we go. And that'll help keep from that bright green in the back distracting from her a little bit. We can probably do something in there like that. Now, as far as sharpening, while we have the raw file open, I like to use the masking tab here on the sharpening, or the masking slider. If you hold Alt on the masking slider and drag it and start to pull it up, you'll see anything here that is white is what is actually being controlled by the sharpening effect. So I like to pull it up some to where you get more on your subject and not just the whole image itself, because I want to really sharpen up the hair and some of the details on the subject without doing too much of the background. So I think somewhere here around, in this case, 62 is fine, and I'm going to turn up my sharpening just a little bit more. And because I shot it at such a low ISO, I don't have to worry about any noise reduction. Everything here looks very clean in the photo. So when you send out a photo to a client, I like to kind of play around with some of the different croppings in case they wanted to print. So for example, if I press the R key, I can bring up the different cropping. And I want to go and play with, let's see, what would an 8x10 look like? Because that's or a 4x5, because that's a very common print size. So right here, it looks fairly well, but she's not centered in the frame. And in order to center her in the frame with this an 8x10 crop for a print, we have to cut quite a bit into the frame. So what I think I'm going to do is when we take it into Photoshop, I'm going to see if I can extend this frame out a little bit on the right, possibly the left as well, so it gives us more room for different cropping variations. Okay, let's go ahead and take this sucker into Photoshop. I'm going to right click on the image, do Edit In, and do Adobe Photoshop. Okay, here we are. So before we get started, I immediately want to copy my base layer. That way, if anything goes awry, we can refer back to that original layer. So with that copy there, what I'd like to do is try to extend this frame a little bit before I do any skin edits or anything else like that. So I'm going to bring up the cropping tool, which in this case is C, and I'm going to pull out the edges here on this side a little bit, and I'll probably do a little bit on the left side as well. So either we can crop this as is and try to stretch out the frame to fill in this empty space here, or if you click the Content Aware tab up here and click the check mark, it's going to try to do an average of these areas around here and kind of fill it in for you. And let's see what it does for us. Sometimes it does a good job, sometimes we might have to do it manually. In this case, it looks pretty darn good, although you can see some of the lines here where it looks like there's like a almost like a dark shadow that goes across here. We can tell that was extended, and on this side it looks like that was almost like a cloning mistake with that same pattern jumping over and over. But in all reality, that's acceptable. But what I'd like to do is Control Z out of that, and I would like to do it manually and see how we can come up with that. So let's extend a little bit more here on this side and a little bit more on this side. So I'm going to turn off Content Aware on this one. And what we're going to do in this case is we're going to extend it manually. So if I press the M tool, it's going to allow me to use a rectangular selection here. I'm going to come in and drag this box all the way up to where it's close to her foot. If I click Control T to transform, now I can click and drag this and pull the selection out. So I'm going to hold the Shift key, and it allows me to pull this direction without going up or down. So I can now stretch this out a little bit until we encompass that area. And press Enter to lock it in, Control D to get rid of my selection. And now that looks pretty darn good. Let's do the same thing to the other side. Click and drag, hit our transform, hold Shift, drag this over to the edge. And now we've extended the frame to where if we wanted to do various croppings, we have more room to work with. So at this point in time, I'm going to do a little bit of skin retouching, which she doesn't need much at all, but there's just a few little things I like to go over. So I'm going to create a new layer here, and I'm going to switch to the Healing Brush tool. Now with the Healing Brush tool, what this is going to allow me to do is sample an area and then paint over another area. So she's got this hair coming down here in her forehead. What I'm going to do is sample an area next to the hair right here. I'll click And now it's going to let me use this area to start sampling as I click and drag down. So I can drag over this hair now and click and drag here and sample another area. See a little bit of acne there. Click sample here, drag over, click sample here, drag over. So you kind of get the idea. So what I'm going to do is go around the photo. I'll kind of speed it up a little bit and take care of little spots like that. So that was fairly easy right there. What I'll probably do in the future is go into other tutorials, maybe a little bit more advanced skin retouching using frequency separation. But for now, I think this is really good. So what I want to get out of here is this ugly grate right here in the front of the stairs. There's another one here, but it's in a lot of shadow and you can't really tell with her outfit and everything hanging down. But we want to make sure we get rid of this sucker right here. So I'm going to create another layer, that way I don't mess with the one where I was doing the skin retouching. And I'm going to use the same tool here, the healing brush. I'm going to make my little target area here bigger, and I'm going to sample just to the left of this grate. And I'm going to go all the way to the opposite end, that way as I paint across, I can start to remove this entire grate. Alright, it's gone. Now if you're as picky as I am, you see this little edge over here. It kind of looks weird to me, so I'm going to target an area here and just try to remove some of that. And I'm going to target various areas to help try to split up this hard looking texture here, because to me it just takes away from our subject. It just looks awkward. There we go. I think something like that will do. Now, as I mentioned before, I like to do most of my contrast here in Photoshop. Now, I've created an action for adding contrast. Let me go ahead and click on it and show you what it does. It just adds that little bit of contrast here, and it's not really affecting her skin tones. But let me show you how I did that. It's very simple. I went to my adjustment layers here, and I added a black and white filter, and I switched it to soft light. Now that right there looks really, really bad, but when I turn my opacity all the way down to 0, you can now click on your opacity tab over here and slowly drag it up and see how it increases the contrast, and it doesn't really affect the skin tones too much. Now I think in my action I created, my default comes in around 15-16% opacity, and that seems to be about the sweet spot for starting with my contrast, and I think I'm going to stick with that. So what I want to do is dodge and burn this photo a little bit. So the client was very concerned about how much brighter the skin was down around her feet because she ran a lot of track and wore a lot of socks, so she didn't get as much tan on that area. So we want to dodge and burn this area a little bit to help it match with the exposure around the rest of her skin. So when I do dodging and burning, I create a curves layer. I turn up the exposure from the middle, and then I'm going to invert it so you can't see it, and I call it dodge. Then I create another curves tool, and I turn down the exposure from the middle here, and I'm going to invert that as well so we can't see it. And this one is going to be burn. And then what I like to do is create another black and white layer, and I'm going to group these together. So this is going to be my dodge and burn curves. I have an action that does all this for me too. And the reason I create that black and white layer is now I'm not looking at color and getting a lot of different distractions. I can only focus on the highlights and shadows. So at this point, I'm going to go to my burn layer. I want to turn my flow for my reticle all the way down to 1%. And now with this turned as white, it's going to paint in areas. Just to give you an idea, if my flow is at 100 and I'm painting on this mask here using white to reveal, see how it makes it much darker? So what I want to do is turn this flow all the way down to 1%. That way as I paint, it's only doing a little bit at a time, and it gives me a lot of control on how much we're really affecting here. So by turning this down, a few different strokes over there, we can already turn off our black and white layer now. And as we do before and after, see we're just starting to slowly darken down those skin tones. So at this point, let's zoom out and look at the before and the after. We've added more contrast. We've gotten rid of the grate. We've extended the frame. We've done a little bit of skin retouching. At this point in time, we're going to do a little bit of sharpening. So I like to click the sharpening action I created. There's many different ways to sharpen. I'm not going to go over that right now. But when you do sharpening, what I like to do is mask out my sharpening layer, basically invert it to where you can't see it. And then I'm going to only paint in the areas on the face, make sure my flow is up. So I like to do the eyes, to sharpen the eyes, the eyebrows, and then I like to do the mouth. Now my sharpening is really making a difference here, as you can tell in the before and the after. So I'm going to turn my opacity way down to about 35%. All right, so I say let's take this sucker back in the Lightroom. We're going to save it, and it should auto-populate back in the Lightroom. All right, here we go. So we have our original RAW file, and now we have our Photoshop edited file. Let's compare. You can tell here's the original on the left. Here's the new edited file on the right. Now this was all of our Lightroom edits, at least, before we took it into Photoshop and made minor adjustments. So at this point in time, there's not a whole bunch more that I would do. I'd like to add a little bit of a vignette on it to where we can drag it down and cut out some of the brightness around the edges of those staircases and draw your eye more towards our subject. And I think I might add a little bit more pop to her skin tones on her face. So I'm going to go back to our masking here, and I can create a new radial gradient, or I believe it's Shift M. And that will do your radial gradient, and I'm going to draw it just around her face here. I've got the feathering up quite a bit on it too, all the way. And I'm going to turn up the whites just a hair. I mean, just a hair, maybe to number 6. Now, if we select our subject again, what I like to do before the final output is just play with the shadows on her a little bit more. I'm going to select subject, and if we turn up our shadows, yeah, there we go. It's making that dress pop a little too, separating her to me even a little bit more than the background, but we're not losing a whole lot of contrast here. So I'll crank it up a little bit more, maybe to 7. Let's see our before and after. Okay, I think that looks good. So now that we're about ready to export, what I want to do is go back to our cropping again and check that 4:5 framing and see the difference that we made. So we're able to crop in like this now and print an 8:10 or a 16:20, and we're not going to lose a lot of data here in the shot. You can still see everything, plenty of room below the feet, plenty of room above the head. You can frame this sucker, have it matted, and you're not going to lose any of the image. And if you can get your image wide enough, or just in general have enough room where you can crop into an 8:10 and it still looks good to you, you won't have any kind of weird cropping issues when you come into Instagram. You can throw this sucker in this 4:5 format right into Instagram, do it from your phone, computer, whatever, and you're going to see exactly what you get right here in this framing. So hopefully this right here helps with this editing process from beginning to end. I didn't go too far in depth in skin retouching. I may pull up an artistic headshot and we can do more into the frequency separation, into the dodging and burning, a lot of the skin details. But for now, I appreciate everybody tuning in. You know, feel free to like and subscribe. If you have any questions or comments, leave them down below. And I'm going to start bringing, I think, more editing videos to YouTube. So stay tuned. Click that notification bell and catch my new videos when they come out. Catch y'all later.